Delphia Corliss was 30 minutes away from letting a surgeon push a long needle deep into her hip and draw the marrow out of her living bones. She was 57 years old. She had already signed every form. They slid across the table. She had already told them her blood type twice and her birthday 3 times. And she had already done the one thing nobody asked her to do. She had leaned over a sleeping stranger and hummed him an old song, the one that came out of a dented tin music box her family had carried up from Alabama 3 generations back. The boy in that bed was 24. He was dying of leukemia. And out of every registered donor on the whole planet, Delphia Corliss was the only match a single computer had ever spit back for him. One woman, one match, his last chance on this earth. She believed she was saving a stranger. She had no idea that the phone charging on his tray table was about to ring, and that the voice on the other end of it was about to tell her what she never expected about the dying boy that was supposedly buried 22 years ago. To understand what that phone rang into, you have to go back with her to everything that had already been taken. Delphia came from people who never owned much and never pretended to. Her grandmother came north with 2 dresses, a Bible, and a little tin music box with a crank on the side that played one tune when you turned it. That music box was the richest thing her family ever held. When you wound it, a small metal drum turned under a comb of teeth, and out came a lullaby so old nobody could tell you who wrote it. Delphia's grandmother sang words over it. Her mother sang the same words. Then Delphia sang them too. Little wren, fly on home. The light's still burning. You're never alone. That was the whole inheritance. Not money. A song and a rusted tin box, passed hand to hand like a deed to something you couldn't sell. Delphia grew up in Syracuse, married a good man named Elam Corliss, and for a long stretch the two of them thought they'd never have a child at all. Then, when Delphia was 32, a boy came. They named him Otis. Elam cried in the hospital hallway and had to sit down on the floor. The heirloom box was too precious to risk on a baby's grabbing hands, so it stayed on Delphia's dresser where it had always lived. But Elam wanted his son to have the wren too. He was a broke man with a proud heart, and he paid a tinsmith 3 weeks' lunch money to hammer out a small copy that played the same tune, a cheap tin twin of the original, so Grandma's heirloom could stay safe on the dresser. Elam had the tinsmith scratch a tiny wren into the bottom of the copy, so anybody would know whose it was. That copy lived on the rail of Otis's crib and rode in his diaper bag everywhere he went. Delphia wound it every single night and sang her grandmother's song over her son until his little fists went loose with sleep. By the time Otis could walk, he'd toddle to the crib rail and slap his hand on that tin twin himself, demanding the wren, and Delphia would laugh and wind it and sing. He used to hide his peas under his overturned cup and grin up at her like he'd pulled off the perfect crime. That was her joy, every piece of it. A husband who worked 2 jobs without complaint, a baby who reached for a tin box in the dark, and a song older than all of them tying the 3 together. She thought that was going to be her life. She had no reason to think otherwise. The summer Otis was not quite 2. Delphia took seasonal work up at a place called Windover, a great camp on Sarin Lake, deep in the Adirondacks, an estate where old billionaire families spent July pretending they lived simple. The Ellsworths had owned it for 100 years. Delphia scrubbed their floors and changed their linens and kept Otis on her hip or in a playpen in the pantry while she worked, his little tin box in the bag at her feet, because there was nobody home to watch him and the money was too good to turn down. She never should have gone. She would tell you that herself if you asked her, flat and worn, like a sentence she had repeated to herself 10,000 nights. There was a lawn party at Windover in the middle of August. 200 people in white, a band on the boathouse, waiters carrying trays down to the water. Delphia was told to work the kitchen, and a young girl from the village was told to mind Otis at the shoreline with the other staff children. It was chaos, the good kind, everyone thought. Music, boats, laughing. And then Otis was gone. 1 minute the village girl had him by the hand at the edge of the dock, and the next there was a scream, and a little brown shoe turning small circles on the surface of the water where the dock dropped off into black. Sarin Lake is glacier cut. It goes down farther than anybody has ever measured in places, and the deep water stays so cold it keeps what it takes. Divers went in. They dragged that shoreline for 4 days. They found the other shoe. They never found Otis. His little diaper bag with the tin twin inside it was gone from the shore too, and nobody thinks twice about a missing bag when there's a drowned child to grieve. Delphia stood on that dock in her apron and refused to scream and refused to faint. She kept telling the deputy that it was wrong, that her son knew to be scared of the drop-off, that she had felt him alive somewhere the whole time like a pulse in her own wrist. The deputy patted her shoulder and told her grief does strange things to a mother, and closed his notebook. The Ellsworth's lawyer, a slick man named Pruitt, appeared at her elbow with an envelope of cash and a paper to sign, calling it a gesture of sympathy. Delphia threw the envelope in the lake. Nobody at Windover looked her in the eye after that. She was a poor woman with a drowned baby and a dead-end story, and the machine of that place closed over her exactly like the water had closed over her son. She drove home to Syracuse with an empty car seat and the heirloom box still on her dresser and the little twin gone to the bottom of a lake with her boy. No child to sing to. Only half a set of music left in the world. Grief like that does not stay in one place. It moves out into a marriage and eats the walls. Elam started drinking to sleep and then drinking to wake up, and within 6 years he was gone too. A bad liver, the doctors said. But Delphia knew what it really was. It was a man who couldn't stand in a nursery doorway anymore. She buried him beside the empty grave they bought for Otis, the one with the small stone and nothing under it. After that, Delphia lived alone and cleaned offices at night. She stopped winding the heirloom box because the Wren song came out of it like a knife, but she kept it on her dresser, dust and all, because throwing it away would have felt like drowning her son a second time. Then one Saturday at her church, a health van pulled up in the lot running a bone marrow drive. A young man with a clipboard explained that a cheek swab could someday save a stranger's child. Some mother out there, somewhere, might get to keep her baby because of you. Delphia sat down in that folding chair and let them swab the inside of her cheek and register her, and she cried right there in the parking lot because it was the closest thing to hope she had held in 20 years. If she couldn't save her own boy, she told herself, maybe her body could save somebody else's. She signed the card and forgot about it. That was how registries worked. Most people swab and never hear a word again for the rest of their lives. Delphia heard. It was a woman named Dr. Selma Voss who called her from a place called the Branagh Cancer Institute in Boston. There was a patient, Dr. Voss explained, a young man, 24 out of options, carrying a tissue type so rare that the worldwide registry had returned exactly one viable donor. That donor was Delphia. Would she be willing to give? Delphia agreed before the doctor finished the sentence. She never asked who the boy was. She asked one thing with her whole chest. Does he have people? Is there somebody sitting with him? Dr. Voss went guarded on the line and told her the family was complicated, that the boy spent most days alone, and Delphia told her she would come early and sit with him, because no child should face a needle that size alone. She drove to Boston. She did not know that a family with more money than God had already reached in and bought the one thing the rules forbid. The donor's name, her town, her history, under the excuse of security. She did not know that a 63-year-old woman named Vesta Ellsworth had read the words Delphia Cruelest, Syracuse, off a private report and gone white to the lips, and had then made a call of her own that said, in effect, proceed, keep her away from his records, and get her out of this city the hour it's done. Delphia knew none of that. She knew only that there was a dying boy who was alone, and that she had a body that could help. So she went up to the ward 2 days early and she met him. His name, they told her, was Harlan Ellsworth. He was tall even lying down, thinned out to the bone by the disease, with a face too young to be that tired. When Delphia walked in, he tried to sit up and be a gentleman about it, and the effort cost him so much he had to lie back down. And he laughed at himself, embarrassed, and that laugh went straight through Delphia's ribs, and she didn't know why. She pulled the chair to his bed and told him she was the match. His eyes filled up. You drove up here for somebody you never met. He turned the words over like they didn't add up. Delphia took his hand and told him a stranger's life was worth every mile of that drive, and then some. Dr. Voss came by that first afternoon to walk them both through what was coming, and what she told them would matter more than either of them knew. Harlan's own marrow was already being burned out of him. Heavy chemo. then radiation, a wiping clean so total his body would have no defenses left of its own. Once that conditioning began, there was no turning back and no pausing. If the new Marrow didn't go in on schedule, to the hour he had nothing to fight with and would not survive it. The harvest could not wait on paperwork. It could not wait on anything. They talked for hours over those 2 days. Harlan told her he'd grown up in that big, cold family and never once felt like he fit inside it. That his mother, Vesta, loved him like a project she was managing, and that his whole life he'd felt like a guest in his own last name. He told her the one thing he owned that felt truly his was a beat-up tin music box he'd had since before he could remember. The only thing the nurses said had come in with him when he was little, and nobody in the family could ever tell him where it came from, or why a rich family son had a dented tin toy that played some old broken tune. As a boy he used to dream of a woman singing in the dark, and his mother would go stiff and change the subject every time he brought it up, until he learned to stop bringing it up at all. Delphia's whole body went cold and then hot. She glanced at the small, battered thing on his tray table and made herself look away, because the alternative was a thought too enormous to stand near without falling. That last morning, before they took her to be prepped, Delphia sat with him while he drifted in and out under the pull of his medicine. And without deciding to, without even knowing she was doing it, she started to hum. Low, under her breath, the wren's song. Her grandmother's song. Otis's song. The one she had not let out of her mouth in 20 years. Harlan's eyes were closed, but his lips moved, half asleep, from somewhere under the drugs. In a broken, almost whisper, that dying boy hummed the next 3 notes back to her. Right on pitch. Notes he had no earthly business knowing. Delphia stopped breathing. She stood up so fast the chair scraped, and a nurse stuck her head in and told her it was time. They needed to get her gowned, and Delphia let herself be led out into the hall on legs that didn't feel like hers, telling herself lots of songs sound alike. Telling herself she was a grieving woman making shapes out of nothing on the day she was finally about to do some good in the world. 30 minutes. That's what the clock on the pre-op wall said. 30 minutes until they wheeled her in. They put her in a gown and taped a line into the back of her hand. Down the hall, through a half-open door, she could still see the corner of Harlan's bed. A tech had taken him for one last scan, and his room sat empty with his blanket thrown back and his phone charging on the tray table. That phone had been in Vesta's hand all morning. Her own had died overnight, and she'd been using her sons to run her lawyers and the people she was paying to make a poor woman disappear. And the phone rang. It rang, and a nurse near the desk called out that she'd grab it, and Delphia, closer, already on her feet, already pulled toward that room by something older than sense, told her not to bother, and she crossed the hall and picked up a dying boy's phone and put it to her ear and answered. There was a breath on the other end. An old woman's breath, thin and shaking. She had hit redial on the last number that called her, sure she was ringing Vesta Ellsworth back. And then a voice, low and desperate, a voice that thought it had reached the family. You have to stop this. The old woman's words came fast and frightened. I'm begging you. I know what you're doing and you have to stop it right now. Do you have any idea who that donor is? That's her. That's the mother. That's the woman from Windover, the one whose baby drowned off the dock. Except that baby never drowned, and you know it, and I know it, because I'm the one who wrapped him in a blanket that night. And now you're going to let her lie down and give her own blood to the boy you took out of her arms and send her home to Syracuse never knowing. I have kept your secret 22 years. I have kept that dead child's bracelet in a drawer 22 years. I will not keep this one. He's hers. Do you hear me? Harlan is hers. He was always hers. Delphia stood in the doorway of that empty room with the phone against her ear, and the whole world went silent and roaring at the same time. Every drop of blood in her body seemed to stop and turn around. Who is this? The words came out of Delphia like they belonged to another woman. Who is this? Say your name. The line went dead silent. She could hear the old woman realize her mistake. She could hear her not breathing. This isn't Vesta. Delphia gripped the phone hard enough to hurt. This is the donor. This is the woman from Windover. This is Otis's mother. She spoke her son's name out loud for the first time in years, and it split her open. You tell me right now. You tell me what you did with my son. The old woman on the line broke into weeping. My name is Wilda Stroud. Her voice folded in on itself. I kept the Ellsworths' house 40 years. I was there that night. God forgive me, I was there. Their own baby, the real Harlan, he died in his crib at 11 weeks that June, up at the camp, and Miss Vesta lost her mind, would not accept it, would not let anyone call it in. Mr. Ellsworth covered it to save her. And then that party, that terrible party, and your boy at the water. Miss Vesta took him. During the screaming and the boats, she lifted him out of that girl's reach and put him in the back of a car, and they let the lake take the blame. They gave your son the dead baby's name and the dead baby's papers and raised him as their own. And there was never any drowning, not ever. Only a shoe they dropped in the water so the world would stop looking. I couldn't say it. I was a poor woman too. But I kept the bracelet. I have proof. He is your son. He is your Otis. 29 minutes on the clock. And every piece of it dropped into place at once, hard, like tumblers falling in a lock. The tin box on that tray table. The boy who hummed her grandmother's notes back to her through his medicine. The age of him, 24, exactly the years since the lake. The rich family that had appeared out of nowhere with a boy who never belonged to them and a toy nobody could explain. For 2 days, Delphia had been sitting beside the one grave she'd never gotten to visit, and it had been breathing. She crossed to the tray, and she picked up his little tin music box, and she turned it over in her shaking hand. Scratched into the bottom of it, worn but sure, was a tiny wren. Elam's wren. The mark her husband had paid 3 weeks of lunches for 22 years and a whole lifetime ago. Her Otis, alive, sick, down the hall. And she was the only person on the planet whose blood could keep him in the world. She could have screamed. She could have torn the line out of her hand and thrown her body between her son and every Ellsworth on earth. She could have burned the whole family down with a single sentence. She did none of it, because Dr. Voss's words came back to her plain and terrible. They had already burned every trace of marrow out of that boy. If the harvest stopped now, if one question about names or consent froze this room for even a day, he had nothing to fight with, and he would die, and no truth, she shouted, would ever bring him back. Telling them now and saving him now could not both be true in the next 30 minutes. She could have her fury, or she could have her son. Not both. So she made the only choice a mother like her could make. The people at Windover had stolen her child once with money and lies. She would not lose him a second time to her own rage. She would give him her marrow, her bones, the life they had spent 22 years poisoning, and she would deal with them after, when he was safe and hers to fight for. That was the whole difference between her and them, and it always had been. They took a child to serve themselves. She would bleed for one and swallow an ocean of rage to do it. But first she asked for 2 minutes. Dr. Voss found her gripping the rail in the hall, and Delphia told her she needed a moment alone with the patient before they went in. The doctor looked at her a long time, saw something in her face she couldn't name, and cleared the corridor. Delphia went back into Harlan's room, where they had just wheeled him from his scan, drowsy and gray. She sat on the edge of his bed. She picked up the little tin twin, wound the crank with a hand that would not stop trembling, and let it play its broken, tinny, unbearable tune into that hospital room. And she leaned down close to her son's ear, the son she had last held at not quite 2, and she sang the words her grandmother sang, cracked and low, tears running off her chin onto his blanket. Little wren, fly on home. The light still burning. You're never alone. Harlan's eyes came half open. He looked up at this stranger who had driven from another state to give him her bones, singing a song he had heard his whole life inside a broken toy and never understood. And he smiled without knowing why he was crying. I know that, he whispered. I've always known that. I know you do, baby. Delphia pressed her forehead to his. I'm the one that taught it to you. He didn't understand it. He was too far under. But he held her hand while she told him, and something in his sick body let go, and he slept. Then they wheeled Delphia Corliss into an operating room and pushed a needle deep into her hip and drew out what her son needed to live, and she let them take all of it. Every second of it, she thanked God, because for 22 years she'd have given both hands and her own heart out of her chest for the chance to give that boy anything at all. The Marrow took. Harlan's counts began to climb within the week. He was going to live. Delphia's younger sister Marva drove in from Syracuse the hour the surgery was done and did not leave her side. Marva was the only living soul besides Delphia who had ever wound that little tin box. When Delphia told her in a hospital cafeteria, both of them shaking, that the drowned boy was upstairs alive with her marrow in his veins, Marva put her head down on the table and cried until a stranger brought them napkins. Then she lifted her head, gripped her sister's wrist, and asked the only thing that mattered. "What do you need, Delphia? You tell me and it's done." It was the first hand she'd held in 22 years that knew the full weight of what she carried. Now, how the truth came out. It wasn't how you'd think, and it wasn't Delphia storming a boardroom. Delphia never raised her voice at Vesta Ellsworth once. She didn't have to. Wilda Stroud came to Boston with a shoebox. Inside it was the hospital bracelet of the real Harlan Ellsworth, dated that June, 11 weeks old, a photograph of that true infant, plainly a different child, and a page torn from Wilda's own diary, written in her own hand the night the family covered a death that never got reported. It was the one thing in the world that proved a billionaire's healthy heir had died as an infant, which meant the young man in the recovery ward could not possibly be who his papers claimed. The truth did to the Ellsworths what no confrontation ever could have. Once there was a bracelet, there were questions, investigators, old camp staff willing to talk, a lake that had never given up a body because there was never a body in it. Vesta's fortune bought her lawyers, and it did plenty, but money cannot unring a bell, and it cannot make a grown man keep calling you mother once he's held his real mother's proof in one hand and a dead baby's bracelet in the other. Because that was the consequence that actually broke Vesta. Not the law closing in, though it did. It was Harlan. When he was strong enough to stand, he read every page in that shoebox and sat alone through a long night with the DNA test that turned Delphia from a kind stranger into his own blood. In the morning, he walked into the room where Vesta waited with her practiced love and her explanations. "I loved you," Vesta told him, and the terrible thing was that it was true. Theft can feel like love from the inside. Harlan looked down at the two bracelets in his hand, the dead child's, and the proof of who he really was. "You loved who you needed me to be." His voice did not shake. "You never once loved who I was. You didn't even let me keep my own name." He set the dead infant's bracelet on the table between them, turned, and walked out, and did not look back. She had stolen a child to fill the hole where her real son had been, and in the end the stolen child was the one thing all her money could not keep. She got to keep the camp, the houses, the name, and the empty rooms. She lost the only thing she had ever taken. Wilda Stroud, 74 years old, came to Delphia trembling, ready to be called a criminal for staying silent 22 years, and she deserved some of it. She had let a mother bury a marriage, a husband, and half her life over a lie she could have ended with one sentence. Delphia took the old woman's shaking hands in both of hers, and she did not lie to her. "I don't know if I can forgive 22 years in one night, Wilda. I'd be lying if I said I could. You waited too long. 22 years too long." Then she pressed those old hands tighter. "But when it finally counted, you picked up that phone. You came, and you came in time, and you gave me back my son. That I will never forget as long as I live." Forgiveness for the rest of it came later, in pieces, over the months that followed, as real forgiveness always does. Wilda got to spend the last chapter of her life near the family she'd helped make whole, unburdened at last, and for a woman who had carried a dead child's bracelet in a drawer for 22 years, that slow mercy was the only reward that ever mattered. And Otis, Harlan, the boy who was two people and neither one for so long. This is where the door has to stay open, because that is where Delphia left it. She could have grabbed him and never let go. She had every right on this earth. But Delphia Corliss had watched a rich woman steal a child by force and call it love, and she would sooner cut off her own hand than take a grown man the same way, even her own. So she didn't clutch him. She didn't demand he be Otis overnight. He had 24 years of another name and another life inside him, and grief and rage, and a whole set of questions about who he even was. She left the little tin twin with him because it had always been his. She gave him the truth, all of it, and her address in Syracuse written on a card. And then she did the hardest thing a mother has ever done in the history of mothers. She stepped back and she let him choose. She went home to that little house where the empty grave still had his name on the stone. She took the heirloom box off her dresser and, for the first time in 20 years, she wound the crank and let the wren song fill the room, and she wept through every note of it. And then she waited, without pushing, without calling, without one single demand, not knowing if the son she'd found would ever walk up her steps, or whether 22 stolen years had built a wall between them that even the truth could not climb. Weeks later, on a gray afternoon in Syracuse, Delphia was at the sink with the radio low when she heard it. Out on her porch, through the front door, somebody was humming the wren song. She opened the door with her heart in her mouth, and there on her porch stood a tall young man, thinner than a mother would want, turning a small dented tin music box over in his hands, his half of the pair, twin to the one still warm on her dresser. He looked at her a long moment, this boy she had grieved and lost and bled for and found. I don't know what to call you yet. His hands kept turning the little box. I've got a lot to work out, but I brought my half of the song. He swallowed hard. I came to learn the rest of it. Whether the two of them could build a life out of 22 stolen years, or whether this was the first knock of many or the only one they'd ever get. That part belongs to the two of them, and I'm going to leave them right there on that threshold, the wren song passing between a mother and her son. So let me leave you with this, and I want you honest in that comment section. Delphia heard the truth 30 minutes before that table, with no clean answer anywhere in it. Would you have done what she did? Finished saving him first, given every last thing your body had, and brought the whole family down after he was safe? Or would you have stopped that operation the second you heard the truth and let the consequences fall right then, whatever it cost? Tell me which mother you would have been. And if this story reached the deep part of you, stay close. The next one is going to ask even more of your heart than this one did.